There is a moment in midlife where everything you thought you had healed comes back louder. The relationship patterns, the emotional triggers, the stories you swore you were done with. But what if it's not regression? What if it's revelation? In this episode of Reproductive Rebel, I am joined by Bev Mitelman to explore how your attachment style doesn't just live in your mind, it lives in your body. And where hormones begin to shift in perimenopause and beyond, those patterns don't disappear, they amplify. We're talking about why you feel more reactive, more sensitive, more activated in your relationships, and how midlife is a portal that is actually an invitation to rewrite the blueprint. This isn't about fixing yourself, it's about finally seeing yourself clearly. Press play. Your nervous system has something to say. Hi, I'm Adrienne Irizarry. I'm an East Asian medicine practitioner who is passionate about women's health and helping women to live their best lives. My goal is to put you in the driver's seat of your health, offering holistic solutions for a symptom-free life. Statements made in this program are for educational purposes only and not intended as a substitution for medical consultation or advice. We do not claim to diagnose, treat, or cure any diseases. This podcast is inclusive and welcomes all gender identities. The focus of the program is on biological function, and we will use the term women throughout, but it is referencing physiological and social challenges for biology, not identity. Come as you are, I am happy you're here and welcome all performances of identity. I hope you find something helpful in this show. Welcome back to another episode of the Reproductive Rebel podcast. I am so excited for today's guest and today's conversation. Welcome to the show, Bev.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you and your audience.
So Bev and I had this really cool conversation in our screening call, and I was like, oh, I have to have her on the show. She talks about attachment styles. So this is not something that we've talked about on Reproductive Rebel, and I think it's a really important piece of our overall health and the dynamics of our health. So before we get too far, can you share a little bit with our audience about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you for that. So again, my name is Bev Mitelman. I'm the founder of Securely Loved. I'm also a certified relationship and attachment trauma practitioner, also a specialist in perimenopause and menopause coaching. So I work with people to help them overcome emotional distress, overwhelm, understand the patterns that they would have adopted in early childhood and how those patterns are no longer serving them in adulthood. The connection to perimenopause and menopause is that, we often will go through, our earlier years, not necessarily understanding that we have these wounds. We often get a point of clarity in that midlife range that helps us to understand, okay, this is why I'm thinking the way I am, and this is why I'm behaving the way that I am. And so I myself, I'm in that age range, going through perimenopause, just sort of on the other end of things. I'm 50 now, so I'm getting closer to menopause. And many women come to me in that age group, and they find that things that they used to handle with ease, they can no longer tolerate. And so I started to really think, what is that connection, right? Why is it that it's usually women in midlife that all of a sudden are experiencing tremendous amounts of stress, and the resilience to stress is decreasing? And, I can go on and on about things that happens in midlife. So that happens to be a lot of the clientele that I serve.
See, just from that, you can tell why I just had to have Bev on the show. So it's so true. Like there's tons of memes out there, like you're chewing too loudly and things like that like are done as a joke, but really speak to how our lived experience in midlife completely changes our sensitivity to noises, overstimulation, stress, all of those kinds of things because of this shifting hormone profile that we're experiencing.
Yeah, and oftentimes there's a whole suite of symptoms, right? It doesn't mean that every woman is going to experience this, all 34 symptoms that could possibly be attributed to perimenopause. But the idea here is that there's a lot of symptoms in regards to your mental health, in regards to how it is that you're managing stress, in regards to sleep. And this becomes very obvious when you're going through perimenopause. And the strategies and the things that you used to do when you were younger that worked well for you no longer work. And so women get to this point of like exhaustion, and they get to a point of like, I'm fed up. Sometimes the body even like shuts down, right? You become less functional to a point where a woman has to say, okay, I have to evaluate, what am I doing here that is really harming myself? And so a lot of women find themselves on this pinnacle of burnout. And that is usually the starting point of their healing because it's no longer sustainable. I can't sustain this pattern. And some of that has to do with strategies that they developed early on in regards to their attachment style and how to interact with people around them, namely their spouse, family members, friends, colleagues, and how they interact with themselves. And so the strategies that we developed that served us so well when we were in our 20s and our 30s, they no longer serve us. We're in our 40s and 50s. And so that's where the overlap between the two are.
I love that. This is why I really wanted to have you on, because I've never had a conversation on this show about attachment styles. We've looked at how trauma can affect relationships, but I think attachment styles, there's more and more buzz and conversation about what that is. But for anyone who is new to this as a concept, can you explain what attachment styles are and then maybe give us an overview of what those are?
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief, right? Because it's a very meaty topic, but essentially your attachment style is how you form an emotional bond with someone else. Okay. So we keep that sort of as a baseline. And depending on the experiences in your early childhood from like 0 to 5, so what you saw, what you felt, what you heard, what you experienced, all of that forms two distinct different types of attachment styles. Like if we pull it back, you either develop a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. And someone who has a secure attachment would have experienced a fair amount of emotional attunement from their caregiver or caregivers, which meant that when the child, for example, was authentically experiencing some emotions, those emotions were handled in a healthy way. So the child would have learned to distinguish and understand their emotions, how to express them, how to communicate them. They would have understood that, you know what, it's okay to be angry, but this is how I handle that. They would have understood, for example, how to cope with their feelings, how to deal with conflict, which you could imagine is such a beautiful set of skills that kids need, right? So when that child grows into adulthood, they're set up really well for relationships with others. They usually have a good level of self-esteem. They're usually emotionally stable. And it doesn't mean that they don't have emotions. It means that they can handle their emotions in a healthy way, right? I can feel it. I can say to someone, I'm angry right now. I need an hour to myself instead of exploding in a rage and punching a wall, right? There's a difference there, right? And so these folks grow up and they're really in a good place to form long-term healthy relationships with others. So we do see this cohort of people, they get married young. They have generally very good relationships. They're emotionally steady. They generally do well in the workplace, have a solid group of friends and so forth. They're the people in your world. And I'm going to ask you, maybe you have some people like this. They're usually like a rock. They're solid. Right. And if you ask them about their childhood, they'll say, you know what, it wasn't perfect, but I felt loved. Right. And I always want to say a couple of things. Everyone has an attachment style. This is what's so interesting about this topic. We all have a way in which we form emotional bonds. And again, because this is so predicated on the relationship that you had with your caregiver, I always want to be careful not to, blame or point finger, your parents did it wrong or they weren't good. For the most part, I think parents generally try to do the best that they can with what they have. We have a lot more information today. Parenting today is different than it was when I was growing up. And so, this is never about blame. Ultimately, you can change your attachment style. So even if you have a style that is insecure, and I'll talk about that in a moment, you can change it. And this is the work that I do with people when they come to me, is that we help to identify these patterns and these wounds, and we're able to actually change your attachment style over time so that you can operate in a more secure fashion, right? So it's not enough to just say, I had a terrible childhood, my parents did XYZ, because as adults, we're now responsible for our own emotional charge, right? Our thoughts are certainly our behaviors.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I put that out there, but I'll talk about insecure attachment styles. So again, you either have a cohort of people who have secure or you have insecure attachment. And in North America, I like to say it's about 50-50 in terms of population stats. It's probably more like 40% secure and 60% insecure. But in social science, things are self-reported. So, we give a margin of error there a little bit. So in insecure attachment, what we're talking about here is that children who grew up in a home where they didn't have emotional attunement or consistent, predictable emotional attunement, they didn't feel safe, right? They were lacking that safety. Then what happens is from there is that typically there are two different paths that a child can go when they are not emotionally connected to their caregiver. One, they can become anxious, preoccupied, so anxiously attached, or they can become avoidant, dismissive avoidant. There's also a third cohort of people that actually develop, this is the smallest group, it's about 10% of the population. They develop a mishmash of anxious and avoidance, and they're called disorganized attachers or fearful avoidance. Okay. And what does this actually mean? So there are so many different ways in which a child can experience non-emotional attunement from their parents. So maybe there's too many children in the home, for the parent to give enough attention to one. Maybe there's a mental illness, right? Or the parents are mentally ill. And so there's a level of, volatility there, unpredictability. Maybe one of the parents is an alcoholic, right? One day they're kind, the next day they're anything but kind. Maybe a child grew up in a home where there was a lot of stoicism. So, there were no I loved yous, there were no hugs. Maybe a child grew up in a home with a parent who was very judgmental, criticized. They were only recognized when they performed, on and on and on, right? So what does this mean? Generally, a child who grows up with an anxious attachment, and they learned early on that love wasn't predictable. So they would have received sort of love sometimes, and they knew that felt good, but often the love was taken away from them. And they will develop, as a result, a core wound of this fear of abandonment. So they might have actually been abandoned as a child, or they perceived that they were abandoned as a child, right? And their strategy in dealing with this, because a child will always try over everything to maintain the bond with their caregiver. So the way that they go about doing this is they become overly compliant. They become parent pleasers, mother's little helper. When they go to school, they're typically, the teacher's pet. They overperform. They become perfectionists. They're the friend that you can call at 3 a.m. if you need a ride to the airport. They just don't say no. And why is that? Well, Adrienne, you probably know the easiest way to get people to like you is to simply say yes to everything. So they overextend, they overperform. They're always focused on everyone else around them. And the thinking, it's subconscious. They don't do this consciously. The thinking is, if I'm such a good sister, daughter, mother, wife, whatever it is, well, no one's going to leave me, right? It's to stave off of that fear of abandonment wounds. So these children who start off as parent pleasers, they grow up to be people pleasers, right? And this is the cohort of people that I talked about really briefly in the beginning that I see a lot of on the brink of absolute burnout when they hit 40, 45, and overextending and focusing on everyone else's needs no longer works for them, right? And we see memes in movies and tropes and all sorts of things where the woman who's been married for 20 years and raised the kids and is always focused on her husband and everyone else, and she just seemingly one day throws her hands up in the air and says, I'm done. This has been going on for a while, right?
Yeah.
When you are anxiously attached, what you learned is that your needs didn't matter. So if you go back to the child who's trying to please the parent, the focus is always on how can I make them happy? How can I make them proud of me? How can I make them love me? And so they don't really develop a sense of self. A lot of these people don't really understand their own needs. They certainly don't have good boundaries, or they don't even understand what that is, right? So you could imagine that when you hit to a period of perimenopause and your hormones, especially estrogen. So estrogen works almost like a veil, like it keeps us calm. So does progesterone, of course. But when the hormones start to fluctuate in midlife and we don't have that stability anymore, it's really like this perfect storm. So the things that, again, you once tolerated just fine, you find that you can no longer tolerate these things, right? And so partners will say, I don't recognize my wife anymore. All of a sudden, everything I do is an issue for her. Like you said, he chews too loudly and that's an issue, right? Well, the thing is that estrogen and progesterone did a really good job when this person was younger in helping her to just sort of tolerate all of these things. They always did bother her. She was able to tolerate it better. And now that she's at a point of like the brink of, I'm just about to really crash and burn here because I had just given of myself so much. She can no longer tolerate even the smallest things.
Oh, I see this so much in my clients.
Yeah. Right. And so it's a combination of sort of just giving so much of yourself away, not recognizing what you need for your own peace, right? And your own harmony within yourself. And then having to deal with layered on all of the symptoms of perimenopause, which we can talk about in a moment. But let me jump to the avoidant person. So I talked about how a child who feels that they're not emotionally connected to the parent can go either two ways, right? They will develop traits of anxiously attached or they'll develop traits of avoidantly attached. The avoidant generally experienced a lot of emotional neglect. This is the pattern that we see often, or enmeshment, like an overly controlling, overly involved mother. They basically learned one of two things, either that love was unsafe and it felt suffocating, right? And it was painful, or no one's coming to rescue me. They were left alone a lot as children. And so this group develops, different strategy. They become hyper independent. They shut down their emotions. This is the cohort that we usually talk about as being emotionally unavailable, although the anxious person is also emotionally unavailable. Although they espouse a lot of emotions, they overfeel, and the avoidants underfeel. They're both considered to be emotionally unavailable because they're not connected to themselves. Right. And so we see in the avoidance, they develop sort of it's me, myself, and I sort of attitude to the world where they're really distrustful, hard for them to get into relationships with others. They're very slow moving. They have a high degree of trust in themselves, but not in others. They're often seen as sort of secretive because they just don't allow people into their world. The way that they learn to keep themselves safe was to sort of erect this wall, right? And so the work with them is to get them to break down the wall and to start feeling and connecting back to their body. So they don't necessarily have the same experience in menopause, right? It's a little bit different. Now, another interesting fact about attachment styles is they're not gendered. And so many people think they are, especially the way we're talking about it here. Usually, when we talk about someone who's anxiously attached, it's often talked about as a woman. And when we talk about avoidantly attached, it's often talked about as a man. But in fact, they're not gendered. So we have just as many men who are anxiously attached and women who are avoidantly attached. I myself grew up primarily avoidantly attached. And so it's interesting to keep that in mind as well. So I'll take a little pause here and because I think that was a big intro. Is that sort of resonating with you?
Yes, I think that this is really important to look at because there is understanding these definitions and the way that relationships, because there's so much change that happens at midlife that, like I remember watching my parents or my mother have a harder experience with communication when she reached midlife. And, and I've heard my father make comments like, wow, you've gotten amazingly outspoken in your old age. And I'm like, yep, I have to. I have to for my health. And my response back to him was, yep, and I'm healthier than I've ever been in my life. Thanks for noticing. And I just kept going. But like, it's one of those things where like our entire cellular makeup is changing when we are in midlife. The hormone cocktail that has fed the expression of the way that our brain functions at a biochemical level is completely changing. We are, in fact, getting a neurological upgrade, which is awesome. But it feels horrible when you're going through it. And because you look in the mirror some days and you go, who is this? Like, I don't resonate with this face that's looking back at me. I feel like a completely different person and I don't know how I feel about it. So then you start putting that into relationship dynamics. And I mean, men go through their own change. Put that out there. Men go through their own change. With my training background, Chinese medicine says women go through 7-year cycles, men go through 8-year cycles, right? So we are changing at the same time. However, men's, just like their testosterone burst is steady state all throughout the day, they have a 24-hour lived experience. They generally go to bed feeling the same way that they wake up emotionally, right? Women are infradian rhythm beings. We typically move on the lunar cycle, which is 29 and a half days. That's why our cycles are generally in that 28 to 30 day category. Yes, there are outliers and I'm talking in generalities, but the point is our entire hormone expression cadence happens over days and weeks rather than happening in a 24-hour period. So that looks different when the biochemical cocktail is changing. And so now we have our lived experience that's stepping into the conversation that's happening with our hormones, and both partners are changing at the same time. However, he is not seeing that he is starting to get more stagnant, and he's the guy that sits on the front porch and yells at kids to get off the lawn. Okay. This tends to be an older man thing. But it's happening because of how his energy is changing, right? Like there's all those stereotypes around grumpy old men, right? But it's happening because of their hormone transition.
It's also happening when they're 70 or 80.
Yes, exactly.
Not 40.
Correct. It's in a much different time in life. Men reach their midlife crisis more in their 50s because of their hormone changes that are happening. For women, we always do everything earlier, right? We mature earlier, we stop growing earlier, and really it's no different when we get to midlife. Our hormones transition first and faster than our male counterparts. And yes, I know that I'm speaking in heteronormative duality, but it's because we're talking about biology, okay? So she looks like she changes out of nowhere because his lived experience is completely different. And he's like, how do I even navigate conversations with this person? I'm already starting to feel this a little bit with my husband, where my threshold for things is changing. My ability to weather stress is changing. I'm 42.
May I ask how old you are, Adrian?
I'm 42.
Okay. Yeah, you're right on the cusp.
Yes.
Yes. And I want to tell you that this is I don't use the word normal. I use the word common.
Yeah, it is.
It's common. And you might, at this point in time, also in early perimenopause, you might start seeing sleep disruptions, which is also very common. Either problems falling asleep or waking up several times a night, usually around the 3 a.m. mark. That has to do with cortisol. You might actually see bursts of rage. And you're like, which is interesting because, again, and like partners would be like, I married the sweetest, kindest, and all that. I don't recognize her. And the truth is, as women, we don't recognize ourselves either when we're going through this.
I thought the rage thing is really interesting that you mentioned that, because I had my first experience with that 2 weeks ago, and it was over the dumbest thing. But I have never in my life gotten to a point, I've been really mad, but I've never gotten to a point where I would define where I was at as true rage. My vision narrowed. Like, it was so intense. It scared the hell out of me. And it was over something stupid, like dishes not being put away in the right place. But it was like all the years behind that of I have asked, I have reminded, I have this, I have that, right? Like where you put all of your energy into this stuff and it's still like your voice isn't being heard, like it doesn't matter. And bang, the lid came off the top. It was awful.
Yeah. And I'm sorry you experienced that, but I want to tell you that what comes out of that is a point of clarity, right? It's not fun to feel rageful. I'm sure you had moments of you felt guilty and shamed afterwards. And like, we do that to ourselves. But what's coming up in that moment, especially you mentioned it was dishes or whatnot, that is, I promise you, attached to an unhealed wound from your childhood that has just sort of pushed through the surface and it's screaming at you, take a look at this. This is what you need to heal. And this is very much connected to your attachment style because the core wounds that we carry are connected to our attachment style. So when people are fighting over the dishes, they're not fighting over the dishes. What you likely experienced in that moment is something like, I am not heard. I am not respected.
100%. I know that's what happened.
Right. And so it's not because he left 3 dishes. It's 10 years ago, I sort of would let it roll off my back. I'm no longer capable or willing to continue my life feeling disrespected by a partner. And our partners have a hard time because they're like, it's just a dish.
Yes.
And you're like, no, it's not.
It's what it represents.
It's what it represents. Right. Now, as people, we tend to embellish. We make stories. We're very good as humans. We make stories. If he loved me, he would have done the dishes. If he respected me, he would have listened the first time. That's not necessarily true. We tend to tell ourselves that. But you can sharply see where this overlap comes into play between those midlife years and the old attachment patterns and those wounds that come up and now become like, they're so present that we're almost forced to address them.
Absolutely. Before we go deeper into this, if you're listening and thinking, I want more of this kind of conversation, the Rebel Frequency Inner Circle is where we continue in. It's a private space with one bonus episode each month, plus small practices and a community of women doing this work in real life. You can join us through the link in the show notes. All right, back to the show. Well, and for me, I find it's actually not my partner that triggers me, it's my kids. But it's the same themes, right? The not feeling seen, the not feeling heard, the not feeling respected part, which
Yeah.
is very hard for me. I want to make sure that we cover that mixed attachment style also, because you had mentioned that as well. And I think that there are going to be listeners that find themselves in that category. So,
Yeah.
just before we continue on, because I feel like this could keep rolling, I want to make sure that we outline what that is.
Well, I'm glad you did. So I spent most of my life as a fearful avoidant or disorganized attacher. It's the same thing. The literature just has different names for it. But essentially, that individual grew up in a home where there was a significant amount of chaos, no stable frame to the home, and or oftentimes there was abuse where the child was abused. It could be physically, emotionally, psychologically, it could be sexually, it could be all of the above. And what happens is that, again, the child is wired to want to maintain the connection with the person that they need for love, support, comfort. But that person is also the one who's harming them. And so it creates a disorganized pattern in their psyche. And what we see as a result is that the child develops this hot and cold behavior, which comes into adulthood. And we see it mostly played out in romantic relationships where they're drawn to you for closeness. But as soon as you get too close, that feels too dangerous, they pull back. So, let's spend a night together, but then I need 3 days alone. Okay. Let's, right.
I've seen this.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. Yeah. Yeah. So it's that hot and cold. And so it really is, there's a sadness there, right? They're afraid. Their core wound is betrayal. It's like the core wound of the anxious attacher is I'm afraid to be abandoned. The core wound of the person who has a disorganized attachment is I'm afraid of being betrayed because that's what they experienced so early on. I loved you without limits and you harmed me. So that becomes really difficult as a framework, as a pattern for someone to grow up and then develop a healthy relationship. And so the other interesting thing about those who are fearful avoidant is they tend to be very hyper attentive, hyper vigilant, right? So when you meet them, they tend to be very present, a little charismatic. They hate small talk. They'll sort of ask you the deep questions right away because they're immediately trying to assess, can I trust you? Do you have integrity? Right? And if you're in a relationship, if someone is fearful avoidant, they're in a relationship with someone who is anxiously attached, that will generally trigger their avoidant side.
I see.
Whereas the opposite is true. If you are fearful avoidant and, I'm in a relationship with someone who's dismissive avoidant, that will generally draw out my anxious side.
That makes sense.
It does, because they really hold characteristics of both, right? It is the most confusing pattern. It's the most complex pattern in that we see that they have the most deep-seated wounds. They have the most wounds in terms of numbers, right? So they could carry any of the wounds that we see from either side. So, some of the core wounds for people who are anxiously attached, we talked about fear of abandonment, but things like, I am bad. I will be alone. I am unlikable. I am unlovable. I will be excluded. Those are all those core wounds. For someone who's avoidant, their core wound is a shame wound, which means they grew up with the sense of there's something defective about me. There's something wrong with me. And so they hide parts of themselves, right? So they're afraid of being engulfed, losing their freedom. They're afraid of being exposed, those types of things. And so the fearful avoidant, that fourth category, as we talked about, they could have wounds from either one of these piles, right? So it's a difficult one. It really is a difficult one. They tend to have the hardest time in midlife.
I was just going to ask if you have somebody from either side, so like an avoidant that is with an anxious, for example, how does that play out in midlife? Is it a little bit more like this mixed pattern that you were talking about, or do you find that they actually like very much polar one another because things get amplified?
So we see this a lot. So, a partner who we often see the trope that it's a woman who's anxious and a man who's avoidant, they come together. And usually when they come together, regardless of their age, it's explosive in the beginning because they fit together like a puzzle. All of the things that the avoidant person didn't get, like they didn't get love, attention, communication without judgment, is all of the things that the anxious person is really good at. Like the anxious person is really, they're very loving. They're very generous. They're very kind, right? To them, feeling loved and giving love is everything to them. And so for an avoidant in the beginning, it feels like, wow, I've never experienced this before. This feels great in the beginning.
That's why I'm asking.
Right. And in the beginning, it feels great for the anxious person to be loved or paid attention to by the avoidant. They're very taken in by the avoidant, right? They're usually very charming. They usually have a very good command of their boundaries, which is intriguing to someone who doesn't have boundaries, right? They seem a little bit like not secretive, but mysterious, right? And they make you feel special. Right. Because, oh, he really doesn't have a lot of friends or, but he's picking me. He wants to be around me. He's opening up to me. You later realize that really the opening up of someone that's truly dismissive avoidant is usually more surface level than anything. Right. And the characteristics that would have brought this couple together in the beginning, for the first 2 to 3 months, they'll have a blast together and then they'll start fighting, because their nervous systems are on completely different wavelengths. So what happens is we have what's called activation and deactivation. So we talked about how the anxious person overfeels and the avoidant person underfeels. So it's not going to take long where the emotions of the overfeeler are going to start to feel threatening to the person who's underfeeling. So someone who's avoidantly attached is really disconnected, avoiding their own feelings, which means they're going to avoid yours as well. They don't want to be burdened by your emotional ups and downs and the level of volatility that you may experience, And we're not talking about just, sort of everyday, I had kind of a crappy day at the office. Generally, people who are really far along on the anxious scale, they really can be quite emotionally volatile. They can be very difficult to be in relationships in. They could test you. They have all sorts of protest behaviors, like they'll overtext, they'll call, they'll show up at your house. They always want to be in close proximity to you. They'll test you. They'll pretend like they're cheating just to get a reaction from you. And all of this drama, and a lot of it is drama, is just too much for the avoidance. The avoidant is like, I'm done. I need peace. I need harmony. And this is too much. So whether it's in your early 20s or your 50s, we generally see this pattern play out the same way. This is not a couple that stays together unless they are both aware of their patterns and doing the work. And so this is usually a short-term thing, or it's an on again, off again. Sometimes we see patterns where they've been on and off again for 10 years, or it's a prolonged situationship. Love that word.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's like, we're sort of together, but we're not, and there's no title. And who knows, right? Because this is not a sustainable relationship. The way in which their nervous systems need to find peace is very different. So the anxious person will always draw closer. They'll always need to be in close proximity to their partner. And the partner who's avoidant needs to take space in order to process and to calm down. And so unless they're actually working on this is not we don't see these as long-term relationships, generally speaking.
That's interesting. So as we go into this midlife stage, it sounds as though hormones tend to amplify
Yes.
these
Great word.
experiences.
Yeah, that's what it does. Exactly. I'm going to pull out my handy little chart. I like pulling this out. I hope you could sort of read some of it. When we start going through perimenopause, there's 34 symptoms that we know of. And I'm so happy that we're no longer just talking about perimenopause as, a couple of hot flushes, because it's so much more than that, right? So there are actually 34 different symptoms, right? Now, what's important for our discussion today is the ones that I've highlighted in yellow are connected to our mental health. And you can see just by looking that it's at least half, right? And this is what doesn't get talked about enough. And when our mental health is affected, of course, it affects us, but it affects everyone around us too. Take a look at the list really quickly in perimenopause leading to menopause. Some of the symptoms that we see very commonly is insomnia or sleep disturbances. Mm-hmm. So just that alone, all of a sudden women, and this is really common, women all of a sudden wake up in the middle of the night, they're not sleeping. And so you would imagine that would contribute to irritability, right? Just that's before we even get to anything else. Then we see that there is, new or worsening anxiety. So someone who's never experienced anxiety before at the onset of perimenopause, and now our hormones are doing some really sort of crazy up and down things, it's not stable. And so anxiety can start playing a part. I have people that tell me that, and this has happened to me too. I've never had an issue being in a car, but, in recent months, I'm finding it really difficult to be in a car, especially as a passenger, right? So never experienced that before, but this does happen. And some women actually start having panic attacks, right? And that is so frightening because if you've never had a panic attack before, you don't know what this is, right? So women go to the hospital, they think they're having heart attacks. They're not even sure, right? And then we start looking at low mood or depression, right? Brain fog. Like I left my condo the other day without my purse. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's other women that would laugh at that because what woman leaves without her purse? Like, I mean, I'm more likely to leave without putting on a pair of shoes, right? But your purse, I actually made it all the way down to the elevators and I was like, I think I'm missing something. So brain fog actually becomes really common. And then we have memory lapses.
Yep.
Right?
I'm already seeing that one.
Yeah. And it's common. Difficulty concentrating, fatigue or low energy. That one hit me really hard. It's still something I deal with, right? And we continue down, lower libido, which is very real, right? So GSM, genital urinary symptoms of menopause, which can be a whole collection of things, from anything from vaginal atrophy to which are changes in the vaginal tissue, to dryness, to painful sex, to urinary incontinence, to a whole bunch of things are associated with this, right? Which could, of course, lower your libido. If you're not enjoying sex, you're not going to be craving it, right? Increased PMS symptoms. And then we get to the bottom of the list, heightened stress sensitivity. And you mentioned this, be loud noises, sounds, maybe at one point you loved hearing kids laughing and now you just can't hear it anymore. Or, I remember I was in New York last year and I was walking on the street and I just found it I was in Times Square and I had been to Times Square before plenty of times, no issues. But when I was there last year, I was like overwhelmed.
So how do you talk about this with your partner? Because I think that is the part of the conversation that I am struggling with my husband right now is he is one of the most reliable partners there is, but he starts saying things like, I don't understand why this is such a big deal. Or, and it's not necessarily from a callous place. It's just I don't understand why you're behaving this way. Or you were talking about the car. We had a car accident many years ago, like almost a decade ago now. Okay. So it's not recent. And I had a little bit of a hard time after we had the car accident. It was our car versus a deer. The deer jumped up out of nowhere. And I went through a period of time where it was fine. And now I've started tightening my seatbelt. I don't even realize I'm doing it. And he called me out on it the other day and was like, oh, you're doing the seatbelt thing again. And he takes it as me not trusting him.
Oh,
But it actually has to do with that floating feeling, that sensation that you get when you're in the car and you're traveling in the car. When I get that floaty feeling, that was the sensation that moved through my body just before we hit the deer. And whenever I get that sensation in my body, I feel uncomfortable. Well, now I'm at this point in my life where it makes me feel anxious when I get that sensation. And I don't even realize that I'm tightening my belt at this point. I don't realize I'm doing it. And, how do you explain or help a partner to understand that these things aren't personal to them? You're having a very big change in your lived experience with this phase of life. And honestly, some of the things are like having heightened anxiety. Nobody chooses that. Nobody wants to feel that way. Nobody wants to wake up 4, 5, 6 times at night. And then if you wake up between 1 and 3, your brain decides to solve the world's problems and you can't go back to sleep. Like, nobody wants that.
right. Yes, it's exactly right. So, I mean, that's a beautiful question. This is your invitation to be more authentic and honest than you've ever been, right? So if your partner is saying, I don't understand it, you might not understand it either, right? And it's okay to say, I'm not really sure why I'm feeling the way that I am now. I'm just going to honor that I am. I don't have an answer, but I'm just sharing with you that I am. Now, that floaty feeling that you're talking about, that's a very common sensation associated to anxiety, or it is. So if for some people, it's sort of a dizziness. For some people, it's sort of a disassociation, or it's even anticipatory anxiety. You might feel it before you get into the car even. And so, I tell people, okay, don't fight it. The more you fight it, actually gets worse. Recognize that it's there. Give it a name if you want, Betty's back, right? Because really, your body is trying to communicate to you that your nervous system is just in overdrive at this point. Okay. So listen to your body. Now, you can say to your partner, it has nothing to do with your driving. I trust you implicitly. I'm just feeling the way that I'm feeling in this moment. And, please don't take it personally. There's not more that you can do than to communicate authentically. If he chooses to believe, really, oh, it must be because she doesn't like my driving, or, that's really his work to work on, especially if you've addressed it head on and say, it's not your driving. I think you're a great driver.
Yeah, I've said that to him a bunch of times. In this accident that I referenced, because he is as skilled a driver as he is, he kept us from having a very medically scary car accident. He really did save our lives. So it is not his driving, but I use that as an example because I am starting to feel some of these shifts happening in my body. I see it all the time with my clients, and they do ask questions like, how do I navigate this? How do I help my partner to understand that it isn't them, it's me, and I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, but that's fair, isn't it? Because it's new for you too, right? So I think, again, it's simply it's authentic, honest communication. Listen, you're right. The last 10 years, I haven't had an issue in the car. I wish I wasn't feeling this way, but I am. And so let me just, take the time that I need to get through it. It's worse when the partner then makes it about them because you're not dealing with your own physical sensations and your anxiety. And then you also have to try to manage as women, we try to manage other people's emotions too. This is the point at which, you make your statement and he needs to manage his own emotions.
One final thought. I could talk to you for hours. I think this is fascinating. And I hope this has been helpful for all of you listening to this, because I think this is an area of midlife transition that we don't talk nearly enough about, and how deeply it affects our lived experience in our day-to-day interactions. Yes. But when we come out the other side, I want to provide the light at the other end of the tunnel. When we come out the other side of this huge life change that our body is going through, do these symptoms come back down again? Like the fever pitch that we feel during the transition, is there hope for people at the other side of this that it relaxes?
Yeah, it does, right? So a lot of these symptoms actually are related to the volatility of the hormones, meaning like they're not stable, right? Mm-hmm. So the body is reacting in a lot of ways because the hormones are going up and down in an unpredictable way. After you get through menopause, and menopause, by the way, it's a very interesting medical term because menopause is just one day. So menopause is one day, 365 days after your last menstrual cycle. And for a lot of women, they don't even know when their last menstrual cycle was. So they can't even identify, it was July 13th when I went through menopause. So it's very arbitrary. It's very silly. But at some point you cross that imaginary finish line and the body stabilizes. And if you're not on something like a hormone replacement therapy, your hormones will be very low. They will stay very low. Your mind will adapt, your body will adapt, and things will even out. So a lot of the emotional changes will calm down. The physical changes will likely remain. So there's a lot of discussion now. Again, I think that HRT, hormone replacement therapy, is a beautiful tool. I think it's a woman's choice. I think that, most women are not necessarily aware that this is an option for them. But there's a lot of discussion right now in terms of, do we use HRT for managing symptoms, or do we use HRT more therapeutically to optimize the body into, the later years so women can live healthy in a non-fragile state and, with all their mental faculties to 80 or 90. Because I think what we know is that women outlive men statistically. But in terms of quality of life, we see that for the most part, women spend the last 10 years or so of their life in very poor health. And that can mean that they have such severe debilitating arthritis or joint pain or dementia, or they're incontinent, or there's all of these things. And there's more and more emerging research right now that talks about hormone therapy as really effective for preventing all of these things. So to go back to your question, does it stabilize after this magical one day of menopause? It does. The body will adjust to your new levels, which will be estrogen and progesterone after menopause. They're like really low. The body will adjust to that. But that doesn't mean you're in an optimized state, which you will likely continue to experience physical decline, even if emotionally you're no longer feeling rage or you're no longer feeling as emotional, right? So I want women to understand that HRT really does two things. So, and it's a personal choice. Again, I don't push it, but the idea here is that it helps with the immediate symptoms, right? And it's really effective when it's started in perimenopause. So HRT is most effective when started within 10 years for menopause, which we know can last 7 to 10 years. For me, my entire 40s, like I just turned 50 last month. So my entire 40s was just all perimenopause. I'm sure it lasted an entire decade. Like, I'm sure of it. And so I only started HRT for myself, I guess about 2-3 years ago. I wish I had started much earlier. It wasn't talked about I didn't even, not one doctor mentioned it as an option. So we need to educate ourselves And so if you're really experiencing a lot of symptoms that we talked about that are disrupting your life, that are disrupting your mental health, that are disrupting your physical body, disrupting your relationships, hormones could possibly help. It's an option, it's a tool, but it's also about extending your wellness and longevity well beyond, right? So things like, we have research now that's suggesting that, estrogen replacement is very helpful in terms of decreasing risk for dementia, in terms of decreasing risk for cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, bone loss. How many women, when they're 80 years old, fall and break a hip? Do you know that there's such a high percentage of women that die within a year of breaking a hip? And so we talk about using HRT not just to manage symptoms that you're experiencing today, but as preventative medicine so that you can live the fullest, longest, happiest life. So does it settle down? It does, but it has to do with lifestyle, your choices, right? It's a number of things, and it is different for every woman.
Thank you so much. I want to be respectful of your time because, again, I could talk to you for hours about all of this. So if people would, that have been listening are like, oh, I really want to have a conversation with you, how can they get a hold of you?
Thank you. So certainly our website, securelyloved.com. Also on Instagram, I try to put out, some interesting information, educational stuff at securely_loved. And I do have a YouTube channel. So I'm trying to grow that. Again, on YouTube, it is Securely Loved. And I'm working to put out all sorts of education. It's mostly around attachment, but I do bring in the topic of menopause often. But I work with individuals, I work with couples, and I do offer a free 20-minute intro call. So if you just want to connect with me, that's free. You can book off the website. And if you're interested also in learning more about your own attachment style, I have a free attachment style quiz on my website, securelyloved.com. You take the little quiz and it gives you a sense of, where am I falling here? Am I securely attached? Am I insecurely attached?
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Bev, for coming on and sharing your time and expertise. This has been such a nourishing conversation. I hope that it really is helpful for our listeners. And until next time, everybody. If you're listening to this and feel like there's still something here for you, like the conversation isn't quite finished in your body yet, that's exactly why I created the Rebel Frequency Inner Circle. It's a private space where we go deeper with one bonus episode each month, small ritual practices, and a community of women who are actually living this work. It's just $5 a month. You can join through the link in the show notes. Come stay in the conversation.